market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Paris, and these are your top stories. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer faces new calls to step down after potential leadership rival Andy Burnham comfortably wins a special election to return to Parliament. Well, the US Vice President delays a trip to Switzerland as face-to-face talks with Iran are postponed. Plus, Bloomberg learns that the U.S. government believes one of ASML's advanced chip-making machines has made its way to China. ASML pushes back against the claim. So there's a lot going on. Happy Friday, everyone. It's been quite a week. Global stocks actually ending a pretty strong week on a little bit more of a cautious note as relief over this interim peace deal between the U.S. and Iran actually gives way today to concerns that there are significant hurdles that remain to secure a lasting agreement. Now, global markets also wrapping up this pivotal week, not only because of this landmark between the U.S.-Iran agreement, but also stocks in general showing resilience, buoyed in part by the frenzy around artificial intelligence. Euro dollar, you can see 114.49, Brent crude 80.21, and then gold 4,157. Now, if you look at European markets, I'll be with you for the next 2 hours. From Paris, a lot of the queue will really be on what's happening with the price of oil. We're seeing green on the screen for the moment. And then, of course, the UK very focused on what comes next politically, with Andy Burnham sealing a pretty decisive win to secure a seat in Parliament. So the UK Prime Minister is facing fresh calls to step down after the Mayor of Greater Manchester was comfortably re-elected to Parliament. Well, Andy Burnham's victory in a special election paves the way for a challenge to Keir Starmer for the top job.
I do say to my own party, this is a final chance to change. This is what people said directly to me on the hundreds of doorsteps that I stood on. We must hear it, we must act upon it, and we must get it right. There will be no second chance.
Let's get more from Ruth David, our Bloomberg London bureau chief. Good morning, Ruth. I mean, this has big ramifications. What are the implications, of course, for UK leadership going forward?
A great night for Andy Burnham, a bad night for Nigel Farage, and a terrible night for Keir Starmer. I mean, we were looking at the gilt markets, which are trading in line with the rest of Europe. And I think one of the reasons is because they are more focused on the price of oil. But there is a sense that investors, for now that Burnham is actually in power, despite the track record of, what he said around bond investors, it seems like investors are shrugging at the moment and waiting to see what comes next. I mean, I think what is clear is that Burnham's victory was the margin of it was what nobody saw coming. And now, you have all these pollsters talking about his chances of becoming Prime Minister this year are 90%. Whereas if you look at the other contenders like a West Streeting or Angela Rayner, they're at close to 1%. So it seems like the markets, it seems like voters are thinking this could be the next leader of the UK.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about these voting patterns, because, I mean, as you say, the Lib Dems and the Green votes pretty much collapse.
Absolutely. I mean, the Conservatives got less than 3%. Reform's vote was split with Restore, and so that means that we are seeing a splintering of the right-wing vote, which is good news for the Labour Party, and it's better news for Burnham because he can make the case that he is Labour's only chance to stopping Nigel Farage's ascent to number 10, and that is the case that Labour wants to make. In fact, when Keir Starmer this morning congratulated Burnham, he was talking about how they have chosen Labour and they have chosen it over the politics of division and hate. And they are talking about unity, though clearly the Labour Party itself is not united, based on the fact that as soon as Burnham won, he is talking about what his party needs to do next. And the implications are clear that his party needs to back him as leader. But one thing that we are seeing very clearly is that whoever comes to power next, right, their fiscal room to do much is so limited. The UK is dealing with a high debt burden. Interest rates costs are really high, so the cost of servicing their debt has gone up the most that it's been in any May in the last 6 years. We're also seeing the continuing impact of the war. The economy is growing at a pace that is quite tepid, and this is a country that has the highest borrowing costs in the G7 nations. There's a lot to unpack here for a leader, especially one who would be coming in without the kind of elected landfall majority that his predecessor had.
Ruth, as always, thank you so much. Our Bloomberg London Bureau Chief, Ruth David. Now, Terminal subscribers can also follow all of the developments through the day on UK politics and much more, but UK politics is where you want to be, and you can just use the function on your terminal T-Live, T-L-I-V, go. Now, U.S. President J.D. Vance has delayed his departure for Switzerland, where he was scheduled to lead face-to-face negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Now, the delay comes as both sides begin a 60-day countdown to transform the newly signed interim ceasefire into a permanent peace agreement. Now, for more, I'm joined by Bloomberg Horizon's Middle East and Africa anchor, Abir Abu Omar. Abir, good morning. So how significant is the delay?
Good morning, Francine. All we know for the time being is a statement by the Swiss government saying that the talks that were supposed to be hosted later today in Geneva have been postponed. It didn't give any further clarifications on the reason behind this postponement. What we're going by, the assumption we're going by for the time being, is that the MOU and its clauses are still in effect. It was signed on Wednesday by President Trump and President Pezeshkian of Iran. And so the two main concessions of it, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, is happening. We're seeing a trickle of movement in the shipments there. And the other concessions is the 60-day period of which the ceasefire would be extended. And that, according to both sides, is also happening. Now, according to our reporting, what we're seeing happening, and one main clause that is being violated, is Israel's hostilities in Lebanon. To be sure, Israel did say that it will not end its hostilities against the southern part of Lebanon and the militant group Hezbollah. But overnight, we've seen clashes that ended up killing over a dozen Lebanese people and 4 IDF soldiers. And so that remains a very sticking point. Lebanon remains a sticking point that we will continue to monitor, Francine.
Abir, thank you so much. Abir Abu Omar, and then we'll see if we get back on track and in what kind of time. Now, global stocks closing a little bit of a strong week with a cautious note ahead of the long weekend in the U.S. We're now joined by Mark Haefele, Chief Investment Officer at UBS Global Wealth Management. Mark, you are the man I want to speak today, given everything that's been going on and equities and treasuries. So what is the market exactly pricing in right now?
Well, I think that right now, we're seeing some relief on the geopolitical front and the oil front. And, we also think that the big message around the Fed is that they're on hold, and we think they're going to stay on hold. And that's going to be good for equities the rest of the year.
Mark, what did you learn from Kevin Warsh this week? Again, there is so much going on. We're seeing inflation picking up. Is the only way forward actually a hike?
Well, I think that the first thing to remember, and I know, Francine, because we've been through this together, is that when you get a new Fed chair, there's always some wobbles around the communication style, and I think we should expect that. But I think Chairman Warsh did something of a masterful job with a little bit for everyone. A focus on price stability, but also launching these task force, which are going to look at productivity, going to look at the data, which may in fact decide what the actual inflation numbers are. So a lot of that is potentially up in the air at the moment. And, when you look at the dot plot, there's that center of gravity moves up, but then it starts to move down again. So I think take Mr. Warsh at his word, be more data dependent, and that's where we're trying to focus, both on the Fed, but also in the rest of markets.
Mark, I know you put it very simply, which is always a good motto, which is focus on fundamentals rather than headlines. And for you, that remains key. I mean, talk to me about AI fundamentals. I mean, does it actually, are you worried about a correction, or do you think overall earnings will stay at these levels?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, we've got the strong earnings. And when we look at this CapEx spend in AI, we see it going close to $1 trillion in 2028. We don't see any signs of abatement there. We do see this kind of shortages in the memory persisting for a little bit yet. Obviously, there are risks. I mean, when you're dealing with innovation at this scale and this speed, certainly things can happen, and this kind of wall of demand for tokens could go away. But we don't see that in the foreseeable future. And we've also got this massive rush for capital as these very large companies that were returning capital are now desperate to deploy CapEx and need more capital. But we do think that this is going to be absorbed by the market, whether it's the IPOs or in the bond market. And so that leads us to see a base case scenario where the S&P 500 can be at 8,200 by the middle of next year.
Mark, give me a sense of what that means for the price of oil. I mean, when you look at your pretty optimistic view of markets going forward, is the baseline that actually there is a U.S.-Iran agreement, at least that holds until the end of the year?
Yeah, well, I think this is a key point. And what we said is, the geopolitical headlines are one thing, but oil is probably smarter than we are. And we really had that kind of $100 a barrel on the forwards as something we were watching closely. And the more time it spent above that probably was going to be destructive to the economy. Now that it's fallen below that, we're getting more breathing room. And I think that, we saw the markets able to go higher even when oil was higher, because the demand destruction, the economic impact of oil is really just so much smaller than this massive wall of AI CapEx and AI demand right now. And so, I think it is really something where you do need to look at the fundamentals and realize just how big a wall of money is going towards AI right now, versus what the destruction is from the oil side. So we think that the president clearly does not want to go back to war. He never moved ships into the region where he could go back to war. So while the idea that there's going to be a nuclear deal in 60 days seems unlikely, we think this is going to get pushed out, and eventually oil can fall again as the strait opens up, which is something that many nations around the world want to have happen. And I think also Iran realizes that their ability to keep it closed, is degrading as we go forward from here.
Mark, give me a sense of then how you allocate capital. How much do you put in U.S. versus Europe versus, for example, emerging markets?
Yeah, well, this is one of the most interesting things that we've found, and it's partially a distortion from the success of the AI trade, is when we look at our clients, 40% of them have the vast majority of their equity exposure in less than 10 stocks. And that's, even after you account for, say, strategic stakes that business owners might hold. And so one of our key messages is, yes, we do like the United States, but people have to diversify, because we do see this AI trade broadening out. We like North Asia, for example. We like EM markets here. So I think that's the thing that people have to focus on, is getting that benefit from equity and other diversifications now, because the world is certainly a more uncertain place.
Mark, I mean, given we've had, of course, SpaceX, I mean, there's a couple of other really big IPOs coming on the markets. I mean, how does that increase risk exposure overall? Does it actually change the nature of a lot of these markets because of the sheer weight of them and how big they are?
Well, I think that, over the short term, again, we think that a lot of this is going to be absorbed. But, over the longer term, it raises a question. If you have so much change, and that change is effectual and is attracting more and more money because it's profitable, that level of change may mean that the multiples on other parts of the market should be lower because the certainty of those business models is lower. And I think that's a longer term concern that we're watching. That's why we're so focused on earnings. And of course, as we look out the rest of the year, what the Fed does, if the Fed starts to hike, that's going to be a big change because typically it is Fed hikes that will kill a bull market rally. So I think, again, like the U.S., it really depends on these individual portfolios and what the concentrations are. The biggest thing is diversify away. Most of our clients do hold regional concentrations, as well as now maybe some industry concentrations. And so fixing that and getting back towards a more balanced allocation is probably the first move.
Mark, thank you so much. Mark Haefele, their Chief Investment Officer at UBS Global Wealth Management. Now, there was a lot to talk about, also a lot to talk about in geopolitics. Coming up, face-to-face talks between the U.S. and Iran are postponed. We'll discuss all of the implications with Laurel Rapp from Chatham House. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. Well, dozens of supertankers loaded with nearly 18 million barrels of oil are preparing to cross the Strait of Hormuz following the interim deal between the U.S. and Iran. Well, for more, we're joined by Al Nightingale, who leads Bloomberg's coverage of oil trading in Europe. Al, there's a great story, actually, which is the first thing I read this morning, saying, look, the Hormuz traffic is really thinning as ship owners are just erring on the side of safety. Like, what are they thinking right now?
Very good question. I think, they're not one homogenous thing. Some are very risk averse. Some are more willing to kind of chance things. But the ones who were risk averse are still risk averse. The ones I've spoken to, or some of the owners I've spoken to, just say that really there hasn't been that much of a change since before the peace MOU. So they're just waiting to see how things shake out. We're not seeing cargo bookings happening for next week yet, which, that should be happening if people have faith that things are going to go smoothly. So, yeah, things still need to happen before we can start to have a bit more confidence that flows are going to really resume in the way that they were going previously.
Yeah, it's true. Significant safety and security risks, of course, to shipping remain out. Great reporting. I urge everyone actually to go and read the story because it's quite granular. And you can really see also by speaking to captains that they're concerned about the safety of their crew. Al Nightingale. Now, the 60-day countdown to a permanent U.S.-Iran nuclear deal has officially begun. But U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance has delayed his face-to-face talk with Iran. Well, let's get some analysis with Laurel Rapp, Director of the U.S. and North America program at Chatham House. Thank you for joining us. Laurel, look, there's quite a lot of doubts emerging on what happens next, on whether the U.S. and Iran would be able to work out some of these contentious details. But is there anything surprising in this? Were you worried that actually the two sides are not meeting face to face?
Look, I wouldn't overread this delay. Of course, it's not a good sign to be out of the gate delaying a visit to start these conversations. But look, this is going to be a very long road. As you recall, the last round of talks the U.S. engaged with Iran on lasted nearly 2 years. So these are going to be very technical talks. The MOU states that there will be a conversation narrowly on nuclear matters. There was a broader question of whether this would also tackle ballistic missiles, regional proxies, even the nature of the regime itself. These were the issues the Trump administration identified as problems for the U.S. as it started the war in the fall or in the early spring. It looks like there's going to be a much narrower conversation in Switzerland when those talks do begin.
Laurel, how's the Republican Party, but also the Democrats actually back home? How are they feeling about this? Is President Trump getting a lot of pushback across the political spectrum?
The only real proponents I've seen of this deal within the U.S. so far are the administration officials themselves. They are out on a tour to explain to the American people and to the world why this is in U.S. national interest. J.D. Vance is the tip of the spear on this one. He was, of course, somebody very reportedly opposed to going to war in the first place. And so he is now the face of this diplomacy. So it's very high stakes for him and his political future. But across the political spectrum on the right, Republicans saying this is a bad deal. It gives too much to Iran, sanctions relief, a potential reconstruction fund eventually. This is not the way to maintain pressure on the regime as the U.S. negotiates. You know, and many on the left, they say, what is the U.S. getting from this deal? This was worse terms than the JCPOA in many ways. And I should say I was involved with that deal from the State Department. I will tell you, these are very complex and detailed negotiations. This initial MOU offers a very thin basis for negotiation that leaves out a lot of questions about where the U.S. will able to effectively leverage its ability to shape Iran's decision making. And it is going to be doing so with fewer partners and allies than 10 years back.
So, Laura, what's the way forward? What do you think happens in the next 6 months?
So, look, there needs to be a resolution on Iran, and I do believe the nuclear file is the right way to start. The American people have also said that is one of the issues that matters the most to them on the hierarchy of regime change to ballistic missiles to regional proxies. The nuclear issue has always been a major concern for the U.S. and would give Iran enormous leverage. And so that is a red line in many ways for the U.S. And so that is the nature of this conversation. But look, there's a mismatch in timelines here. There's a mismatch also in who might want this deal more. Trump has said that the economic catastrophe is something that he's seeking to avoid here. He's looking very closely at the midterms and how badly this war has played with the American people over the past months. So my prediction is there's going to be a muddling through. There's going to be many rounds of talks, likely inconclusive. The Iranians are very adept negotiators at extending timelines and drawing out processes to then forestall further military action. I think there's a collective view that the U.S. is now going to be less willing and less interested to use military force if these talks go off the rails in any way. And the big question ahead is whether Hormuz will be a toll route for a lot of commercial shipping. That is, it's toll free for the next 60 days while this deal takes shape. But after that, it's an open question.
Laurel, in the 45 seconds we have left, where are the European leaders in all of this? I mean, because of the G7, because there was also the MOU signed in Versailles, it feels they're getting a little bit more of a space or face time between, the President Trump and even Iran.
That's right. So I was fascinated to read the G7 communique. These are documents we negotiate as diplomats at the lower level, send them up the chain. The G7 communique directly in the same sentence links progress on the Iran talks with more sanctions pressure on Russia, right? So the big thing the Europeans went into the table on was to push for greater Russian economic pressure in the oil and gas sector. You saw Zelensky sitting at these meetings over the past couple of days, and the Europeans got Trump to sign off on more pressure in the sanctions regime for Russia. That is a big gain and something that they have not been able to do to this point. The big question will be, will the U.S. actually reimpose those sanctions on the Russian oil and gas markets now that the pricing is going to be coming down on Iran?
Laurel, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Laurel Rapp there, the director of the U.S. and North America program at Chatham House. Now, coming up, has China got hold of one of ASML's most advanced chip-making machines? That's what we discuss next, and this is Bloomberg. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer faces new calls to step down after potential leadership rival Andy Burnham comfortably wins a special election to return to Parliament. The US Vice President delays a trip to Switzerland as face-to-face talks with Iran are postponed. Plus, Bloomberg learns that the US government believes one of ASML's advanced chip-making machines has made its way to China. So sticking with that story, that big and important story, ASML is pushing back on those concerns, saying it has never shipped any of its EUV chip-making machines to China. Well, let's bring in Bloomberg's Sarah Jacob in Amsterdam. Sarah, this is a Bloomberg scoop. I know it's been thoroughly researched, so talk us through exactly why this is a big challenge for ASML.
Good morning. Yes, so ASML is the only maker of these most sophisticated tools. It's called the Extreme Ultraviolet Lithography Machine, and some of the biggest chip makers use them to make advanced chips. So we're thinking like TSMC, for instance, uses it to manufacture processors for NVIDIA. So an EUV tool is the size of a bus, a school bus. It costs about 200 million euros, and it needs constant upkeep from, ASML employees. So what we've been told, and we've reported in the story, is that the Commerce Secretary has, raised concerns that an EUV tool may have found its way into China. It's important to note the context of this. ASML has never been able to sell these tools to China because of the U.S. government's, the U.S. administration's push to sort of stem China's advances in the semiconductor industry. And basically, if this were to have actually happened, it would be a significant violation of export-led curbs, and I think would present a big challenge for ASML yet in this current Trump administration.
So what has ASML's response been to these suggestions?
Yeah, we're told by sources that ASML has pushed back on these suggestions. Our report said that ASML has begun circulating a document in Washington, which is basically titled that there's no indication of any ASML EUV tool in China. ASML has basically said that in that document, they've said that they can detect any interruption and they have a clear visibility on their machines, the number of machines that exist that are in circulation, the number that have been decommissioned. They kind of know if there is a loss of connectivity in any of their machines, and that you can't really remove a particular or transport any of these or relocate any of these systems without ASML involvement because it involves specialized equipment. And the spokesperson, of course, telling us on the record that, they have never shipped a machine to China or even components.
Is the lack of access to EUV tools a key constraint for China's companies, Sarah?
Yeah, EUV machines are critical, like I said earlier, to make these most advanced chips, and ASML has a monopoly in that. It's taken ASML decades, several decades to fine-tune this machine, to work with their supply chain, to work with customers, to build it up, and it's not easy to replicate. We haven't actually seen any comparable machine out there yet. We did hear recently from Huawei that they are making innovations in this space, but without the use of an EUV machine, yet it remains to be seen, what progress they make there. So it's going to be I think important to see how this all plays out.
Sarah, thank you so much. Sarah Jacob there. I urge everyone, again, it's great reporting. It's an important piece of news. Go on the website, go on our terminal, and read the latest on ASML. Now, European leaders have been holding talks with tech bosses over access to their most advanced AI models after the US moved to block foreign access to Anthropic's Mythos model. Well, the European Union says it's also in talks to secure access to the latest tech. Well, Tom McKenzie spoke with Henna Virkkunen, the EU's top technology official at Viva Tech in Paris.
With the AI service providers, I think we have good dialogue in the European Union because here again we have legislation. So we have our AI Act in the European Union, and it means that when the AI service providers, when they are coming to our markets with very capable models, they have to notify that to our AI office, and also they have to assess the risks. And also now from August, we will have also the enforcement power, so it's also possible for us that we are also making requests for them to mitigate the risks or give access to the model.
If Europe does not have access to Mythos, what are the cybersecurity vulnerabilities? It leaves Europe exposed if we do not have access to this model.
That's why it's very important that we are also working global level and with our partners to address those risks. So I think with those companies who are having with the very capable models, I think we have also good dialogue with them, but we can expect that there will be coming more that kind of models in the coming months, and maybe not everybody coming from USA. So it's very important also that we are well prepared when it comes to our cyber security, because we know that these very capable models, they are able to really identify in few hours that kind of vulnerabilities in our cyber security environment. And that's why in few weeks' time we will also adapt our action plan on cyber security, where we are looking at what kind of new measures are really needed also in the European level.
France is removing and replacing Palantir software. The German military has done the same. Is that a measure that you welcome? Should Palantir be removed in other nations? Is it a risk?
All the member states, they are assessing now the risks what they are having with their services. And of course, when we speak about very critical services, like for example, defense industry and defense information, we are also sharing that opinion in the European Commission side, for example, that in cloud services, we should use only European service providers when it's about defense. So when it's about very critical sectors of our society, external, internal security, law enforcement, defense, in that kind of services, it's very important that we are controlling the technology from Europe.
Palantir is a vulnerability then if it's used in European defense systems.
We haven't assessed that in the European level, but now some of our member states, they have done risk assessment on that, and they have made also their decisions based on that.
Is the US still a trusted partner after all of this?
USA is a very important partner for European Union when it comes to field of security, defense and technologies.
Is it a trusted partner?
It's important also for Europe to look that we don't have risky dependencies, also that we are not too dependent in critical sectors of one country, of one company, and that's what we are now doing. In the same time when we are, of course, cooperating with our partners.
Bloomberg's Tom McKenzie there speaking with Henna Virkkunen, the EU Tech Commissioner. Now, the President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, has been defending his reaching out to Russia after EU leaders voiced their frustration at the move. The exchange really reflects the bloc's disjointed attempts for renewed peace talks with Russia. Well, we're now joined by our Bloomberg chief European correspondent, Oliver Crook. Ollie, good morning. So what's the problem with Costa actually reaching out to Russia?
Yeah, this is a piece of actual Bloomberg News, a scoop that we reported earlier this week that's actually really setting the agenda and the conversation at the European Council meeting here today. We have all of the leaders now sitting around the table, and one of the issues that has been very prominent in the conversations that began last night is this piece of news that the European Council president, his team, reached out to the Russians to try to sort of establish a back channel, a diplomatic channel between the Europeans and the Russians for the time and the eventuality in which a negotiation that would be led by the Europeans would be appropriate. There's obviously been a lot of divided opinion about the fact that he did this. There's been a lot of pushback from a number of important European nations like the French and the Germans. There are others, on the other hand, that are actually more all right with this initiative. That being said, Francine, I think it puts into prominence this debate that we're going to be having much more here in Europe after the Trump administration effectively abandoned their diplomatic efforts to try to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. After those sort of high-profile meetings with Trump and Putin, there is a real question about the Europeans since they have no diplomatic avenue, and they also do not want to have to miss their place at the table. This is a conversation that I had both with the Latvian Prime Minister and the Lithuanian President yesterday. Have a listen to what the President of Lithuania said about this move from the European side.
I welcome all the efforts, and especially the efforts of the U.S. President Donald Trump to step in and to assist in this process of peace negotiations. But first of all, Russia and Russia's dictator should come to this conclusion himself, that this war cannot be won, and the Russians are not prevailing anymore, And probably for him personally, it's the best time to look for the compromise and for the consensus.
So a real mix of opinions there. As you can imagine, Francine, the Baltic nations, the ones that neighbor Russia more proximately than other nations within Europe, really take issue with engaging with the Russians in a point when they don't feel that there is a real dialogue to be had. That being said, we're now in the 5th year of the war, so there's a lot of sort of legitimate questioning of what is Europe's diplomatic plan. There's a question about potentially putting forward a single diplomat to be in charge of those relations with Russia, with that dialogue. There has been some reporting in the past that Angela Merkel might be one person, Mario Draghi might be another, but I do think that there is a dawning realization here in Europe that they do need to have a united front, someone who speaks for all the Europeans, because you've had a few sort of side missions with some of the European leaders trying to reach out to Russia. You'll remember Emmanuel Macron tried it, Olaf Scholz tried it. We've had a couple individual initiatives, and that is something that really many of the nations within Europe are uncomfortable with. The real question is Antonio Costa the right person to do that? He says, and his office says that he is, because as the sort of voice of the European Council, the representative of the EU 27, that is the appropriate person to spearhead that effort. And of course, that's going to be one of the main conversations here. The other is one that is perhaps divides opinion even more, and that is the path forward on China. Real questions about the sort of trade deficit, how to push back against it. There is a growing conversation now that the Europeans might have to get a little bit more serious with their trade measures on China. That being said, they probably won't act today, but it's something that you're going to be listening to a lot of over the next few months.
Ollie, thanks so much. Oliver Kirk there, Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent. Now, coming up next, well, how does the supply chain of the chocolate croissant shed light on the impact of the Middle East war on food prices? We'll have plenty more on that next. You don't want to miss that next section. I promise you. This is Bloomberg.
Is a chance now, from this result tonight, to build a new politics based on unity and hope, turning away from the path that takes us to a divided, dark politics of the kind we see in the United States. We must now take this path and put this country back on the right path and bring people back together and get things working properly again.
Andy Burnham there, the newly elected Labour MP for Makerfield in Greater Manchester. And we'll have plenty more on the implications of this win in a moment. Now, the conflict in the Middle East and the subsequent closure of the Strait of Hormuz sent shockwaves through the global economy. Eleanor Thornburg, our EMEA agriculture reporter, has also been tracking the ingredients in a chocolate croissant to show how the war's impact on food prices will linger. Eleanor, it's a really great piece. So when people hear about the conflict and the impact it's had on the Strait of Hormuz, they think of oil tankers, they think of energy supplies and fuel prices. Why should they also be thinking about the price of a croissant in London?
Well, Francine, I think it's mainly because food and energy are a lot more interconnected than perhaps the average consumer realizes. So when we were doing the reporting for this story, what we found is that every ingredient and every layer had been touched by the conflict in one way or another. And you can think of lots of examples. I mean, farmers, they need fertilizer, they need diesel. Millers, very energy-intensive operations. Truckers, they need fuel in their tanks to deliver food around the world, right? And even things like packaging materials are impacted by petrochemical markets. So it's not as if food has gotten away from this scot-free, even though a lot of the headlines have kind of focused on oil and gas. So, yeah, by the time a croissant reaches a cafe in London, the war itself is, yes, thousands of miles away, but I think the impact is going to start feeling a lot closer to home because it's all going to start being baked into the price that you pay for one.
Yeah, it's just a brilliant story. I mean, look, for research, Eleanor, I did have a croissant. Someone ate all the chocolate croissants in the Paris office. I won't mention names, but it's brilliant because it really comes to life, right, how it impacts inflation and our day-to-day lives if we're lucky enough to have croissants, chocolate croissants in London. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is reopening. There's this interim deal in place, but why is the story not over?
I think it's because food supply chains don't really recover or maybe bounce back in the way that financial markets can. So even though in theory there's this interim deal and the strait is meant to be open for business, many businesses have already dealt with months of disruption. And when you're in agriculture, you have to think about planning, investment, producing. And they've done all of that factoring in this disruption. So fertilizer shipments delayed, energy costs higher, freight rates surging, all of this. And food manufacturers often operate on long-term contracts, which means that it can take a bit of time for all of this to work their way through the system. So one economist we spoke to said it could be about 6 to 12 months before all of this finally reaches supermarket shelves. So in theory, I suppose, on paper, the geopolitical crisis is over, but it's not like the economic consequences have disappeared overnight. They're still very much making their way through the system.
So, Eleanor, just going back to the croissant, because I can't get it out of my head, you basically traced the journey of a single pain au chocolat from farm to cafe. So what does that journey really tell us about how food inflation works in 2026?
I mean, it's interesting. I guess food inflation, it can feel like a shock or maybe a bang that comes out of nowhere. But what our reporting showed us is that it's really about a lot of these very small increases accumulating over a very complex supply chain and how they kind of build up from there, almost like a wave that forms. So by the time that a pastry reaches a cafe, all of these businesses along this international supply chain have had to deal with higher costs. And I think that's why inflation at the moment in particular, it's felt so persistent, because yes, some things get resolved and some crises ease, but realistically, a lot of things linger. They linger in shadows and corners. So I guess the story at its core is kind of about how interconnected global food supply chains are. And yes, that can be a strength, but in moments like this, it can also make them very vulnerable.
And consumers, of course, have already lived through COVID, the war in Ukraine, and years of inflation. So is this really shaping up to be another major food price shock?
I mean, it's difficult to tell. I'm not an economist per se, but I guess what I would say is I don't think we're looking at a repeat of the huge spike in inflation that we saw after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But I would caveat that and say that it's perhaps not the best point of comparison, because this time, well, the issue is that consumers have already dealt with high food prices for some time. So, for example, in the UK, food prices now are about 40% higher than they were in 2019. So even if this results in very small incremental food price increases, they're going to be landing on households that have already dealt with this for some time. So the risk isn't necessarily about this crazy inflation emergency, perhaps. It's more the people who were hoping for some economic relief are unfortunately going to have to cling on and wait a little bit longer.
Brilliantly said, Eleanor. Thank you so much. I mean, it's just a great piece of reporting by Eleanor Thornburg, Bloomberg's EMEA agriculture reporter. Now, let's get more on Andy Burnham's return to Parliament and the implications for the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer with Jane Green, politics professor at the University of Oxford. Jane, I mean, there's so much. I mean, just to put it very simply, it feels like Andy Burnham has a bit of an aura. I mean, how difficult is it for Keir Starmer to stay in power?
So Andy Burnham he does have an aura, and he does have, a slight edge in leadership polls when compared to Keir Starmer. But what he has, of course, is credibility and a reputation in the Northwest that has allowed this election victory to be significantly easier for him in what has boiled down to a two-party race in Makerfield between Labour and Reform. The challenge now, though, is that there's twofold. One is that he has, I think, approached the kind of strategy of winning elections as focusing on the cost of living and trying to win support across ideological divides. He's shown that he can win an election where Keir Starmer has, of course, been losing elections consecutively, local elections, by-elections, since 2024 and losing support in the polls. However, he then has to try to take that credibility that he has in the Northwest and now earn it if he becomes Prime Minister in the country as a whole. And that's going to be far more difficult. And he's going to be subject to the kinds of buffeting, the kinds of declines that governments very, very frequently experience in the polls in periods of government that, if he's Prime Minister. So he has that credibility in the Northwest. That's helped him in Makerfield. But can he do that nationally? Keir Starmer is going to be making the argument that he won't necessarily be able to do that. And Labour MPs, obviously, who are backing Burnham, are clearly going to think that he can.
Yeah. Professor, I mean, there's a lot of questions that stem from that. One is, I mean, also, Andy Burnham is not tested in the markets. So if you look at some of his fiscal policy, I don't know whether he goes more back to the center and whether a market wobble could actually decide or make Labour stick with the current Prime Minister.
So I think, what's the big kind of question for Andy Burnham is that here he is, somebody who people are talking about as the next Prime Minister of this country, without a manifesto, without a clear economic agenda, but with that credibility that he's gained in the northwest of the country. Now, you're right that it's going to be extremely important for him that he reassures the markets, not just for the markets, not just for the economy, that of course he hopes to then benefit from a more buoyant economy, but also because the poll ratings that Labour has are going to be very sensitive also to whether or not Burnham is trusted on the economy. And of course, that's why he's building an advisory circle around him, including the likes of Andy Haldane, that I think is not just about learning, but it's also about signal sending. It's also about reassurance. It's also about saying, look, I'm advised by and taking heed from the kinds of people that the markets trust. And I think that's very, very, very purposeful, exactly to your point.
Professor, why exactly is there, I guess, a want in the Labour Party to, replace Keir Starmer now? I mean, he's been 2 years in the job. Could he not have a resurgence ahead of a general election? And is there a danger that Andy Burnham comes in, he feels the need to call a general election, and then it doesn't go his way?
Well, Keir Starmer has really, since coming into power in 2024 with a huge majority, but nevertheless historically low vote share for a party governing alone. What has happened since 2024 is that Labour's support has been eroding very, very, very substantially. They lost around, in the opinion polls, around half of the support that they had compared to 2024, and that support already started very low. So Keir Starmer has been Prime Minister in a period where Labour MPs are just terrified, frankly, about losing their seats, but also much more existentially terrified about the possibility that Labour's lack of popularity and Keir Starmer's lack of popularity, because his leadership ratings have been extremely negative, historically negative, that's going to open the way for a reform victory. So I don't think it's true that Labour MPs have particularly wanted a change of leader, but I think they have been extremely concerned about Labour's ratings in the polls, Labour's performance in the local elections, in consecutive by-elections, and then, essentially feel that they're in a situation where, for many of them, not all of them, but for many people, they feel like they have no choice now but to change leader in the hopes that they can win support again going into another general election. But that is very risky. And that's risky because Labour's majority in 2024 was built on the basis that the left coalesced and that the right vote was very split. Now, we've seen some indications of a split vote in Makerfield because Reform have, very likely lost some votes to Restore. Restore got 7% of the vote in Makerfield. But that isn't a split as the right vote was in 2024, where it was the Conservative Reform contests that were mainly splitting the right vote and helping the Labour Party win. And so it's risky because the right vote needs to split and the left vote needs to coalesce for Labour to win another majority. And obviously, what is very likely to happen is that an incoming new Prime Minister, if that indeed is what happens, will be watching those opinion polls very, very closely to see whether or not there's the kind of bounce that Andy Burnham is obviously hoping for, whether that is both large and also persistent. And that's very much yet to be seen, of course.
But, Professor, very quickly, what will you watch out for in the next couple of weeks? I mean, Andy Burnham will have to talk to Labour voters. He'll have to meet with people. He'll have to, I guess, keep the, give the sense that the economy would be stable under him. Are there 2-3 key moments or people that you're watching out for?
I think the key thing to watch out for now is how smooth a transition could there be a smooth transition where Keir Starmer essentially steps aside and allows Andy Burnham, with the backing of a potential new cabinet within the Labour Party, to take place? Does that transfer take place smoothly and calmly and the market's reassured? Or are we going to see Keir Starmer digging in and there being a leadership contest and just another period of instability? And of course, the markets are not going to respond well to another period of instability and also of uncertainty. And so that is the critical question in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, Professor, thank you so much. Beautifully said. Exactly what we needed, to the point. Jane Green, their politics professor at University of Oxford. Now I'll be back very shortly with Bloomberg Markets, and this is Bloomberg.